Let's ask all the members to please take their seats. This hearing is Iran's destabilizing role in the Middle East, and the committee is going to come to order at this time. This morning we look at Iran's considerable efforts to destabilize the Middle East. When it comes to Iran, attention has rightly been focused on efforts to stop its nuclear program. But as one witness will explain this morning, Iran's nuclear program is just the tip of the revolutionary spear that extends across the world and threatens key U.S. interests. Iran's foreign policy, he goes on to say, is subversive, sectarian, and set on goals that would come at the expense of U.S. interests. He's right. Indeed, with Iran's long support of terrorist groups, and support of militias and adversarial regimes, the region has been feeling the brunt of this revolutionary spear for quite some time. Thanks to Iran, Hamas has rearmed since 2012. Iran is the one that rearmed them. And nearly 80% of Israel's citizens are fleeing to bomb shelters this week as a result. With Iran's aid, Shia militias within Iraq are rearming and they're mobilizing. The Assad regime, with the Iranian forces, with Quds forces, and with Hezbollah, continues massacring Syrians. With Iran's aid, Hezbollah is able to threaten Israel with over 25,000 rockets, and I can say that I saw some of this firsthand during the Second Lebanon War. I was on the ground in Haifa as those rockets were coming in. This was before the invention of the Iron Dome. There were 600 victims in the Rambam Trauma Hospital, and they were targeting civilian neighborhoods. And Houthi rebels, supported by Iran, are closing in on Yemen's capital. Now that's quite a record for a regime now sitting across the table from us in Vienna, where the administration has conceded that this #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world arguably can enrich uranium. My concern is that they're conceding that. I hope it is not conceded, because that is the pathway to a nuclear weapon. Of course, these aren't random efforts to support terrorism by the Iranian regime, but concerted actions by this Ayatollah-led, and he's the key decision maker, this Shia-led government, to overturn what Iran believes is a regional power structure that favors the United States and favors Israel and their collaborators. And when they say collaborators, of course, what they mean is the Sunni Muslim governments in the Gulf. This is a recipe for disaster for the region. It's a recipe for U.S. interests there. And today, Iran's work is on full display as hundreds of rockets have rained down on southern Israel. It is Iran that provides, again, the funding, the weapons, the training to Hamas and other Palestinian terror groups. Iranian leaders have admitted to providing the missile technology that Hamas used against Israel during the last Gaza conflict in November 2012. And just the other week, a UN panel of experts concluded that rockets and weapons concealed on the Klaus Sea, including long-range M302 rockets, long-range rockets, originated from Iran. Other shipments have gotten through as Hamas have fired the recently acquired rockets for the first time, and of course those bring all of Israel within, or nearly all, within range, certainly Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. These weapons put 8 million people into Gaza's range of fire. One of them struck Hadera, a coastal city between Tel Aviv and Haifa, 73 miles north of Gaza. In recent years, Iran has come under increasing strain from international sanctions aimed at stopping its nuclear program. This is what, frankly, got Iran to the table. When we talk about why they're at the negotiation table, it is because of the sanctions passed here and adopted. But even with its economy damaged, Iran has managed to provide robust support to extremist proxies as part of its broader geopolitical agenda across the region. As one ambassador from the region shared with me, what do we think is going to happen if they come out from under those sanctions with respect to the capital that they'll then have at their disposal for destabilization. Now the United States and other world powers are negotiating a final nuclear agreement with Iran that would lift most of the sanctions. Bad deal or good deal, and many of us fear a bad deal, any sanctions relief will bolster Iran. As one witness notes, Iran stands to gain $100 billion in frozen bank accounts and billions as oil exports resume. That's a lot of M-302 rockets. How will an Iran unchained by international sanctions treat its neighbors? I hope how it treats its own citizens aren't an indication of how it's going to treat its neighbors. How are the United States and our allies positioned to counter Iran's destabilizing activities in the Middle East? I'm afraid we're going to hear from one of our witnesses today, not well. And I'll now turn to the ranking member for any opening comments that Mr. Engel of New York has.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this timely hearing about Iran's destabilizing role in the Middle East. As Iran continues waging its charm offensive with the international community and negotiating with the P5+1 over its nuclear weapons program, we cannot forget a basic fact. Iran remains the most active state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and Iran is a key driver of regional instability. From Syria and Iraq to Yemen and the Palestinian territories, understanding Iran's nefarious behavior is essential to protecting the interests of the United States and our allies. Even as Iran's economy continues to falter under the weight of international sanctions, leaders in Tehran are plowing their scarce resources into elements of Iran's security apparatus that support terrorism, particularly the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and its Quds Force. Iran also provides funding, weapons, and other support to a wide range of terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. All of these groups have been designated as foreign terrorist organizations by the United States, and we will continue to treat them as such no matter what happens in the nuclear negotiations. I want to emphasize a point that you made in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, with which I certainly agree, and you and I have talked about this a great deal. It was sanctions that brought Iran to the negotiating table. It was sanctions that made Iran think twice about moving forward. And I don't think we should remove those sanctions while for any situation that is not preventive of Iran being able to have a nuclear weapon. I don't think we should willy-nilly loosen sanctions on Iran. I think we should keep the sanctions until we see that they are dismantling their nuclear program. Last week, Chairman Royce and I sent a bipartisan letter to President Obama, signed by more than 340 House colleagues. That's more than 3/4 of the members of the House of Representatives. We asked the Congress to consult, we asked the President to consult with Congress on the scope of any potential sanctions relief. The letter noted that U.S. sanctions on Iran are based not only on its nuclear weapons program, but also on Iran's ballistic missile program, its support for terrorism, its human rights abuses, and its development of chemical and biological weapons. Even if a comprehensive nuclear deal is reached and it enjoys broad support on Capitol Hill, it is safe to say that Congress would not lift all sanctions on Iran unless it ceased to be a bad actor in the region and dramatically improved its behavior in all of these areas. With hundreds of Hamas rockets raining down on Israel, we see the real impact of Iran's support for terrorism. In March, the Israeli Navy intercepted the Class C, a ship carrying Iranian rockets to the Gaza Strip, including dozens of Syrian-produced long-range M-302 rockets, which are capable of reaching high-density Israeli population centers such as Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa. By deliberately targeting civilian areas with these deadly weapons, Hamas is committing war crimes aided and abetted by Iran. I have to laugh at the crocodile tears coming out of the Hamas terrorists in Gaza talking about the civilian population. I think yesterday was an eye-opener for many people when the Egyptian brokered ceasefire was accepted by Israel but rejected by Hamas, it's clear to see who wants peace and who refuses to want peace. And Hamas would not and could not be so bold without all the support it has received from Iran. Iran, again, is the #1 supporter of terrorism around the world, and Hamas is a terrorist organization. So in almost every conflict in the region, we see Iranian fingerprints as Tehran seeks to spread its influence and manipulate its neighbors. Iran's support for Assad in Syria and for Hezbollah's intervention in the Syrian civil war has given the regime a new lease on life and resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent Syrian civilians. Assad would not be winning, potentially, in Syria if it wasn't for Hezbollah, a terrorist organization supported, funded, maintained, and controlled by Iran. Iran's support for Hezbollah has also destabilized Lebanon and allowed the terrorist group to amass tens of thousands of rockets on Israel's northern border. Iran's involvement with the Maliki government and with radical Shia militias in Iraq have undermined efforts to establish a more inclusive government in Baghdad. So I don't think the U.S. should be cooperating with Iran on the situation on the situation in Iraq, and I was pleased to hear Secretary Hagel's remarks last week confirming that we are not doing so. So, Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, let me say at this time of great instability in the Middle East, we need to remain clear-eyed about the capabilities and intentions of our adversaries, especially Iran. I look forward to hearing the testimony of our distinguished panel of witnesses, and thank you again for holding this important and timely hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We now go to Ms. Eliana Ross-Leitonen, Chair of the Middle East Subcommittee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. While the administration takes unilateral steps to offer concessions to Iran as it pursues a weak nuclear agreement, it continues to disregard our calls for congressional oversight and our warnings on dealing with Iran while ignoring its destabilizing efforts. The regime in Tehran continues to actively and openly work against U.S. national security interests across the globe in Iraq and Syria. It arms and finances terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Ted Deutsch and I just came back from a trip to the region, and many leaders expressed to us that pushing back Iran's breakout capability is not as important as dismantling Iran's nuclear infrastructure would be. Iran doesn't need the bomb to be dangerous. Just having the capability to get the bomb is enough to spark a nuclear arms race in the region. Instead of offering concessions to the regime, the administration should be pressing Iran to dismantle completely its nuclear program, abandon its support for Assad and its terrorist proxies, and cease its provocations against the U.S. and our ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, or else we will impose even stricter sanctions that will bring Iran's economy to its knees. It's the sanctions, stupid. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and we appreciate you and Mr. Ted Deutsch's recent trip to the Middle East. Mr. Deutsch is the ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee. We'll go to Ted Deutsch for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Engel, for holding today's hearing and for your continued leadership and attention to Iran, not just on the nuclear issue, but to the whole of Iran's habitual bad behavior. We're just days away from seeing whether Iran is truly committed to finding a diplomatic solution to the nuclear crisis. But even if there is a diplomatic resolution to Iran's ongoing quest for a nuclear weapon, it would not change the fact that Iran would still be the largest sponsor of terrorism in the world, would still be assisting the Assad regime in Syria, and would still be repressing the basic human rights of its citizens. I would caution those who think that if a nuclear deal is reached, that the world will simply ignore Iran's other violations of international norms, including its meddling in regional affairs and attempts to incite instability in other countries. In the more likely scenario that a nuclear deal with Iran is not reached, or if the duration of the deal is not long enough, an Iranian regime that still possesses the capability of developing a nuclear weapon would surely set off a nuclear arms race in the region. Mr. Chairman, we will know a lot more about Iran's intentions in the coming days. We must also be making our intentions clear. Deal or no deal, the U.S. will not turn a blind eye to Iran's attempts to exploit a volatile Middle East. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Brad Sherman of California is ranking member on the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee.
Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terror. Hezbollah, Assad, a reach that included the Buenos Aires Jewish Community Center, a point on the globe as far from Tehran as one can get. Now imagine an Iran with the impunity of being a nuclear weapons state. But we should realize that we have limited bargaining power. We do not have Iran's economy completely on the ropes. We did not adopt sanctions that were effective 10 or 15 years ago. We did it 10 or 15 months ago. We brought them to the table, but we have not brought them to their knees. Unless we can imagine Iran with no centrifuges, no terrorism, and no theocracy. But I don't know whether we've rallied public opinion to the point where we're willing to, for just example, ban Chinese imports to the United States as long as Japan maintains an or China or any other country maintains an economic relationship with Iran. That is a level of sanctions that I think goes beyond what we can adopt here in Washington. We are wise to have this hearing to illustrate to Americans and Europeans why it's so important that all options remain on the table. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished group of experts on this subject. Dr. Ray Takei is Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Takei was previously a Senior Advisor on Iran at the Department of State. He was a professor at the National Defense University. We also have Scott Modell, Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He serves as a Senior Advisor to U.S. Special Operations Command on counter-threat finance issues. He was previously a Senior Officer in the National Clandestine Service at the Central Intelligence Agency. And Dr. Nathan Sachs, Natan, as he's known, is currently a Fellow at the Brookings Institution Center for Middle East Policy. Previously, Dr. Sachs was a Fellow at Stanford Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, and a Fulbright Fellow in Indonesia. So without objection, these witnesses' full prepared statement will be part of the record. We're going to encourage them to summarize, and then we'll go to questions. Members will have 5 calendar days to submit statements and questions and anything extraneous for the record. Dr. Takei, if you would like to begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a privilege for me to be here again, as well as with my colleagues, Scott and Natan. I'll just briefly discuss some aspects of my testimony. I think the high drama of arms control negotiations and diplomacy in Vienna today dominates our impressions of Iran and defines those. In the next couple of weeks, the diplomats will debate how much centrifuges are to be traded for how much sanctions relief. There is already talk that negotiations may be extended past July 20th, given the significant gaps that remain between the two powers. Nature of inspection regime and enforcement mechanism will also be discussed. Whether a durable agreement can be negotiated with an unreliable partner, as you suggested, such as the Islamic Republic, will be put to a test. Hovering over all these technical issues is the challenge of addressing Iranian revisionism in the era of nuclear diplomacy. Tehran, as was mentioned, is busy advancing its claims in a contested Middle East, and Washington would be wise to check the surge of Iranian power and negate its regional designs. The key actors defining Iran's regional policy are not its urbane diplomats mingling with their counterparts in Europe, but the Revolutionary Guards, particularly the famed Quds Brigade. For the commander of the Quds Brigade, General Qasem Soleimani, the struggle to evict America from the Middle East began in Iraq and now has moved to Syria. Syria is the front line of that particular resistance. For the hardliners in Iran, the Sunni states' attempt to dislodge Bashar al-Assad from power is really a means of weakening Iran. The survival and success of the Assad dynasty today is a central element of Iran's foreign policy. Next door, Iran's model of operation in Iraq actually draws from its experiences in Lebanon in the early 1980s, when Iran essentially amalgamated various Shi'i parties into lethal Hezbollah organization, and Hezbollah has remained the instrument of Iran's foreign policy since then. Since the removal of Saddam, Iran has similarly been busy strengthening Shi'i forces in Iraq by subsidizing their political activities and arming their militias. Iran hopes that Shiites will continue to exploit their demographic majority to solidify their political gains. But should the political process fail, they must be sufficiently armed to win the civil war. The purpose of Iran military dispatches to Iraq initially were to evict the United States, and now it is to maintain the viability of Shia forces. A certain misapprehension, I think, was born in Kabul and has migrated to Baghdad, namely that we need Iranian assistance to stabilize our war-torn charges. The ISIS surge in Iraq is once more portrayed as an opportunity for the two powers, United States and Iran, to collaborate. The stark reality remains that the United States launched Iraq with much sacrifice on its path of precarious stability despite Iran's harmful interventions. And to do so again will require American initiative rather than Iranian benevolence. Iran's fundamental interests in Iraq tend to diverge from those of the United States. We ostensibly seek an inclusive Iraq with greater participation of Sunni forces in the Shia government. Iran desires a Shia hegemony with a veneer of Sunni participation. Iran essentially desires an Iraq that is estranged from the Arab councils and at odds with the United States. Today, as you mentioned, the region is gripped with fear that arms control policy will lead to a larger détente between the United States and Iran. This concern has some justification in history. During the heydays of arms limitation talks between the United States and the Soviet Union, nuclear accords were often followed by commerce and diplomatic recognition. Washington has often been seduced by the notion that nuclear agreement can pave the way for other areas of cooperation. The challenge that the United States faces today is to defy its own history. America must find a way to impose limits on Iran's nuclear ambitions through negotiations while restraining its regional ambitions through pressure. This will require rehabilitation of America's battered alliances in the Middle East. Strategic dialogues and military sales are not going to be sufficient. Washington can reclaim its allies' confidence, but it cannot do so without being an active participant in Syria and Iraqi sagas. Further attempt to exempt ourselves from these conflicts will mean that our pledges will ring hollow to a skeptical Arab audience. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor.
Chairman Royce, members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to come here today. You've read my testimony. I think everybody's sort of in agreement with what I've summarized in my testimony. There are a few points I wanted to extract from it, expand a bit on it, and one was the idea that I think has been encapsulated in some of the initial comments was basically that Iran, beyond the nuclear program, approaches its revolutionary agenda in a whole-of-government approach. There's a lot of talk here in the United States about how we do things around the world in sort of incorporating a whole-of-government approach. Currently working in the Pentagon, and a lot of our time is spent trying to figure out how do we bring together State Department and a variety of agencies to accomplish certain foreign policy objectives overseas, and it's not easy. But if you look at what Iran does from bottom up in terms of trying to project their power and trying to accomplish their agenda throughout the Middle East, they really do take a whole-of-government approach, certainly more so than the Arab states that I've seen. The nuclear deal, I think, one of the things that I'm continuously seeing and hearing that really surprises me is the fact that people are they're considering giving a pass on the possible military dimensions of the program. I hope that's inaccurate. We've been watching this for over a decade, and it's almost astonishing that could be ignored. So in the run-up to a deal and discussions between the administration and Congress on the implementation of a long-term deal, I really hope that is addressed. I also agree with the chairman that I think the revolutionary agenda is going to go on. It's years ago, I recall, 2011, 2012, members of the Basij who were posted over, into Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. There were several public interviews, and they were asking them what they thought about Iran's agenda in the region. And these were public interviews, and they said, well, our agenda is to create a 1 million-man force across the entire region. They recently said that again. They're interested in making a 200,000-man force that's going to spread from Iran all the way to Lebanon. I think there's a lot of obstacles in the way of doing that, but the core objective remains true, and you can see they're pushing on that objective constantly. The other thing I would say is just because Iran is involved in P5+1 talks and has been for some time, I think there's a quick rush to assume that the proliferation activities have stopped. I think in the run-up to an agreement, or in the aftermath of an agreement, people are going to start wondering, what is this inspection and verification regime going to look like? And I would posit to you one of the most important aspects of it has to be how do we devise a new containment strategy with our allies in the region, not only with the IAEA inside looking at facilities to ensure they're not cheating and abiding by the terms of the agreement, but it's the external part that they've built up and done such a good job of over the last decade that it contributes to proliferation and has allowed them to move their program so far forward. When we start to think about how we're going to work together with the GCC more effectively in the future and develop a new containment strategy, we have to have that in mind. And I've recommended a number of ways in which we should start thinking about how the U.S. government should be using resources overseas to that end in my paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs.
Thank you very much, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members and staff for the opportunity and honor of speaking here today, especially alongside Ray and Scott. I'll speak briefly about Israeli views of this issue. While there's considerable goodwill in Israel toward Iranian people, the Islamic Republic's regime is viewed very differently, and with good reason. Indeed, virtually no one in Israel, including those who strive in earnest for peace with their Arab neighbors, expects good relations with the Islamic Republic as currently constituted. Nonetheless, important, though limited, variation exists among Israeli policymakers on the regional challenges posed by the Iranian regime. The remainder of my testimony, I will touch very briefly on the spectrum of Israeli views on two such regional challenges: Iran's nuclear program and its involvement in terrorism and conflicts abroad. In my written testimony, I elaborate further on these issues and discuss related question of an alliance of interest between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And Iran's nuclear program. It's important to note first that far more unites Israelis on Iranian nuclear issue than divides them. Diversity of opinion exists, but the spectrum of opinions is narrow and much more limited than on other issues, such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Virtually no one in Israel's national security elite, nor for that matter in the US, doubts Iran's intention to reach threshold nuclear capabilities. Israeli experts, and indeed the government, do not contend that Iran has already decided to build a nuclear weapon, but they do not doubt that Iran intends to have the capability to do so. Further, almost all in Israel view the possibility of a nuclear threshold Iran as a very negative development for a variety of reasons. Most mainstream thinkers support the need to project a credible threat to stop Iran's nuclear program if all else fails, even by means of conventional force. And yet, there remain meaningful differences among mainstream Israeli thinkers. First, not all view the Iranian nuclear threat with equal severity or use the term existential threat to describe it. Some argue that even if all failed, Israel would be strong enough to deter a nuclear Iran. Most people abroad believe Israel has a second strike capability. Notably, Iran believes this. An Iranian acquisition of nuclear weapons might then entail a grim, but perhaps stable, Cold War logic of mutual assured destruction. This debate rests, of course, on a related debate, that of Iran's rationality, which I'll be happy to discuss if asked to. Second, there is important variation among senior Israeli thinkers on what might constitute an acceptable deal with Iran. Some central figures have suggested that very low levels of uranium enrichment, coupled with stringent inspection, might leave enough time to react to an Iranian breach of an agreement. Third, and perhaps most dramatically, there are different views in Israel on the wisdom of a unilateral strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. The Israeli cabinet and security forces have been strongly divided on the issue, and former security officials have warned publicly against a unilateral strike. Polling suggests that the Israeli public, too, is divided on the issue and is skeptical of a unilateral strike without U.S. support, and I'll stress that point. Note that there is considerable difference and tension between the need to project readiness to strike if all else fails, something which nearly all Israelis support, and actual support for a strike, on which opinion diverges. While the credible threat of a strike could help the diplomatic track, its credibility can be undermined when these differences emerge publicly, as they have. In sum, on the threat of Iran's nuclear program, far more unites Israelis than divides them, but some differences exist on the extreme severity of the threat, the nuances of remedies, and on the wisdom of unilateral strike. By comparison, there is very little debate in Israel on Iran's involvement in conflicts and in terrorism in the region and abroad. In the past, there was some debate over the degree of Iran's control over Hezbollah, its most significant subsidiary abroad. Some argue that Hezbollah should be viewed more as a Lebanese party than an Iranian proxy. The civil war in Syria has largely ended that debate in Israel. At Tehran's behest, Hezbollah has sacrificed greatly in casualties and in sinking popularity among Arab and Lebanese publics, and yet it has done so. Beyond the immediate region, Hezbollah, along with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, also carry the threat of global terrorism against Israeli and even non-Israeli targets. Most famously, the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, AMIA, 20 years ago this very week. Of special concern to Israel at this very moment is also Iran's involvement with militant Palestinian groups, most notably the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, a close Iranian subsidiary and very violent terrorist group. Hamas's relationship with Iran is more complex. Unlike PIJ, Hamas is a large political party as well as a terrorist organization. Hamas is also an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and its relations with Shia Iran and with Assad's regime in Syria, once robust, have soured. Nonetheless, Iran and Syria have been suppliers of weapons for militants in the Gaza Strip, including Hamas. Syrian-produced M302 rockets, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, for example, have been used against Israeli civilians in the past week. Let me conclude by noting a key concern of all Israeli policymakers of the full spectrum I described. Israelis fear that should a deal with Iran be reached, whether before July 20th or after an extension, there will be some in the international community who will view the issue as closed, the nuclear issue and other issues. In reality, the success of any deal will depend completely on the monitoring and verification embedded in it. Israelis are therefore likely to continue to focus on this issue. U.S. interests, which are aligned with, though not identical to, those of Israel, would be well served if the United States, too, maintained a vigilant, pragmatic, but realistic watch over Iran's policies in the future. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
We appreciate your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Sachs. We go now to a question that I have for Mr. Modal. And this goes to your testimony that by most accounts, you say Iran stands to gain access to nearly $100 billion in frozen banks, as well as billions more as oil export restrictions are lifted. That's part of any agreement. Whether that agreement is good or bad, that's the consequence. Could you translate that impact of this relief? What that would mean? What operational capabilities do you estimate the Iranians could develop or acquire as a result of the release of this funding?
Mr. Chairman, sure. One of the reasons why the tempo of Iran's operational activity over the last year or so since sanctions kicked in earnest has been exactly that. They haven't had the funding to fund all of their units. They haven't had the funding to do certain things. It's as if it would be the same way with the U.S. government or any government for that matter. In times of financial crisis, there are certain things you got to cut back and certain things you can't. In the case of Iran, with a surplus, with an influx of $100 billion, plus bringing back oil online, the IRGC Quds Force becomes much more active. Funding that goes to proxies in the region goes back up to pre-sanctions levels. And you start to see more activity in places like Yemen. You start to see more activity in places further outside their normal operating area in the Middle East. They've had to cut back activities in Latin America and Africa and other places because of the sanctions. Those activities will pick up, particularly on the covert side, in my opinion.
So the added advantage that what they might perceive as a windfall, what would that give the regime, specifically in the region? If you were just to look at them in the Middle East, sort of the low-level insurrection that they support in Saudi Arabia and some of these other, among the Shia population there and some of the other developments, could you maybe specify what that would mean?
One of the things that I would say is what they've been trying to do for a long time now, and they did this, and Dr. Taki had mentioned this. In the 80s, they had a number of Hezbollah movements outside of Lebanon. They tried to replicate the example of Lebanese Hezbollah in Bahrain and Hezbollah the Hijaz in Saudi Arabia and so forth. They've been trying to do that again, and they're going to continue to do that in Kuwait and Bahrain and Saudi. So with extra money, it's exactly what they would try to do. They're focused on eastern Saudi Arabia. They're focused on Kuwait. They're focused, again, I mean, they've stated very unequivocally that their goal in Bahrain is to empower Shiites and it's the overthrow of the monarchy there. So those goals become much more attainable with money and with extra units that are focusing on those.
What surprises me is the sheer amount of weaponry. You know, as I mentioned, when I was in Haifa, I mean, at that point in time, it was tens of thousands of rockets that they had at their disposal, and now it's maybe five-fold that. So that's over a decade now. Let's just look at Hamas. It's getting its funding, its weapons, its training from Iran. We go to March 2011. Israel intercepted the Victoria, intercepted that ship off its coast. There were C-704 cruise missiles, as well as a lot of mortars, but cruise missiles capable of targeting Israeli shipping and ports that Israel said were bound for Hamas in Gaza. Then you've got on March 5th, they intercepted a ship in the Red Sea that Israel said was carrying Iranian advanced weaponry bound for militants in Gaza, possibly via Sudan. You see these, what do we call them, 302, M302, long-range rockets now that they're putting their money into. Why in the middle of these negotiations would they run the risk of ramping up with resupply of even longer-range rockets? And this is another question I have. I listened to this speech that the Ayatollah gave recently in which he said it was the duty, as I recall, the duty of every military man to mass-produce ICBMs. Why would he take the middle of the negotiation to go out and transmit that kind of message through his armed services?
Fundamental difference between the revolutionary agenda he has and the way that we would like them to come into the mainstream international community. It's as simple as that. He separates the nuclear negotiations. Like you said, the only reason he's come forth for the nuclear negotiations is out of dire economic necessity. That has nothing to do with his revolutionary agenda, which they are continuing to push day in, day out. And that's what and that is the message, quite frankly, that he plays to his domestic audience, and he wanted us to know as well. They're looking for, he said it, and Foreign Minister Zarif has repeatedly said, we are not looking for rapprochement with the West. We hope that these will lead to common ground, and nothing more than that. We're going to continue to push forth in our support to militants in Gaza. We're going to continue to push forth all of our objectives in the region, which I've stated over and over in this paper, and you guys have said as well. And when you look at the bases of operation that they have that are expanding in places like Sudan and Ethiopia and others, all of that doesn't stop with a nuclear agreement.
I'm out of time. We'll go to Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with you, Dr. Sachs. How is Israel likely to view a comprehensive Iranian nuclear deal? Will they see it as one that empowers Iran and allows Iran a freer hand on destabilizing activities in the region?
Thank you, Mr. Engel. The question is, in part, who in Israel? The government and almost everyone would view it with great suspicion. There's very little trust in Iran in their intentions of the Islamic Republic. There is some hope among some that a deal, if it were stringent enough, might help delay somewhat the advancement of the nuclear program. And so in that sense, there may be some minor relief. But Israel, as I mentioned, will be very concerned that any deal will bring about rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran, would bring about a relief of all the sanctions, and would most importantly make others in the international community go to sleep on this issue. Israel would very much like everyone, itself, the United States, and everyone else, to remember that this problem will remain. I imagine that the reaction in Israel probably to a deal along the lines that we've been hearing will be negative, but the question is on the nuance of the negative. Israel may view it as a terrible deal that it cannot live with. If the terms are strict enough, it may view it as a step that perhaps will halt something that it views as very bad, but maybe one that it can live with in the meantime.
In your testimony, you alluded to Israel commonality with some of the Sunni Arab states, such as, you didn't say it, but such as Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates on Iran, similar outlooks. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. There is, as others have noted, there's a very common concern with Iran. I do think, though, the reasons are quite different. The Arab neighbors of Iran have long-standing challenges with the Islamic Republic, and even with Iran itself. There's geopolitical issues, and there's, of course, the Sunni-Shia divide that has really engulfed the Middle East at the moment. All these things are things that Israel is not concerned about. Israel is first and foremost concerned about the two main issues we've been talking about today, the nuclear program, and Iran's very active destabilizing activity in the rest of the region. And so there is room for cooperation, and it's very important. It's room on the nuclear issue. It's room on closing Iran's opportunity for activity abroad. But it stems from a different cause. I'll add one more thing, which is that the public aspect of this alliance is very difficult. The Arab street, public opinion, is very sensitive to the Palestinian issue, and especially these days. And this makes it harder for Israel and Saudi Arabia to publicly engage. Although there have been, even despite that, there have been public instances of meetings, for example, of former chiefs of intelligence between the two countries. In other words, there is hope on this, although there, I think, are some limitations.
Thank you. Let me talk a little bit about Iranian support for Hamas, and perhaps, Dr. Takei, I can start with you. There have been some differences between Hamas and Iran since they take different sides. In Syria, Iran supports Assad while Hamas opposes him. How do you see this playing out? People have said that Hamas is more internationally isolated now than it's been in the past, isolated from Egypt, isolated perhaps from Syria. Is there a chance that this might reduce Iran, that it would cause Iran to reduce its material and moral support for Hamas?
I think historically, the Palestinian rejectionist group that has had more in common with Iran has been the Palestinian Jihad. However, Iran has always had an instrumentalized approach to Hamas, namely whenever Hamas has an agenda that's common with Iran, which is essentially intrusion against Israel, then they come together. The notion of supporting Palestinian rejectionist groups writ large has been the central aspect of Iran policy, so I don't necessarily think that there's going to be any adjustment in that, particularly at this time when this has some degree of street popularity.
Is it surprising to you Iran has been supporting and supplying Hamas for many years, but in doing so, Iran, by doing so, is crossing the Shia-Sunni divide in order to help the Palestinians. Is that something that we should be alarmed about?
Iran has always suggested that its policy in the region is not a sectarian one, that it will essentially make common cause with Sunnis that share its agenda. It is the Sunni street that's like to portray Iran mostly as a Shia state. But essentially, Iran has always tried to have a pan-Islamic approach and to essentially unite Shiites and Sunnis that share the same common objectives. Now, that has become very difficult as the region has become subject to such sectarian division. And Iran, at this particular point, is more closely aligned with Shia state, but is always open to dealing with radical Sunni groups that share its perspective.
Mr. Modell, do you have a comment on that?
The only thing I would say is when you look at the trajectory of transnational organized crime and the use and Iran's collaboration with like a group like Lebanese Hezbollah, for instance, there are a considerable amount of Sunnis and Shia that are involved in those activities, and I don't think Iran has any problem crossing for political convenience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman.
He's going to defer to Eliana Ross-Layton in Florida.
He's a gentleman. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, as you are. Iran agreeing to the weak and easy to live up to interim agreement is just another ploy by the regime to win concessions and buy more time. And now that the deadline is quickly approaching, an extension must not be given. Instead, we need to start re-examining our sanctions program against Iran and ways to counter its illicit and destabilizing activities. We have no reason to trust this regime, but we have decades of proof that shows Iran's true colors. One of the very first acts of terror of this current regime in Iran was responsible for, after the '79 Islamic Revolution, was the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, led by a group of students but spiritual followers of Khomeini. These terrorists held 52 American diplomats and citizens hostages for nearly 450 days. Iran has been a United States designated state sponsor of terrorism since '84. It has been repeatedly redesignated by the State Department of a country of particular concern for its continued and flagrant abuse of religious minorities. And the regime has been highlighted year after year by our State Department's country reports on human rights practices for its abysmal human rights record. Then, of course, we turn to the nuclear issue. Iran was discovered to have been operating a covert nuclear program for decades in an attempt to create a nuclear weapon, a covert program that we did not find for years. So what confidence do we have that we will be able to catch Iran cheating again? That's a question. Now, there are 6 UN Security Council resolutions against Iran's nuclear programs, resolutions that demand that Iran not be allowed to enrich any uranium at all, and yet Iran continues to be in violation of those resolutions. It continues to make progress on its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Yet from the very beginning, administration after administration have failed to hold the Iranian regime accountable for all of these aggressions, for all of these aggressive acts. The hostages of the '79 crisis have yet to receive their justice. Our policy must be to seek justice for our citizens who have been victims of terrorism, hold the terrorists, such as Iran, accountable, and appropriately compensate the victims. The administration, this one, as have many others before it, with other rogue regimes, believes that a nuclear agreement can open up avenues for further cooperation. But we saw this with North Korea and others, that this is never the case. What is the danger in dealing with Iran as if its nuclear program exists in a vacuum? This is somehow, that it's somehow not related to all of Iran's other illicit and problematic areas. In the administration's continued negotiations with Iran, we have managed to alienate and even anger some of our traditional partners and allies in the region, and our credibility just keeps going lower. At what cost will this nuclear deal impact our foreign policy and objectives in the Middle East in its totality, whether an agreement is reached or not? And what would be the benefit of alienating all of these countries, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, and even Israel, who has a very real and existential concern over Iran's nuclear program, in favor of an Iranian nuclear agreement that many believe will not go far enough? What would be the benefit of alienating all of our allies? Thank you, Doc.
Thanks. I'll begin this. I think there has always been something unusual and peculiar about an arms control approach, because essentially assumes that you can segregate your arms control technical disputes with all the other range of disputes. So in order to have an arms control approach, you have to continuously use the phrase, yes, but. Yes, Supreme Leader is an anti-Semite who denies the Holocaust, but nevertheless, he can be a suitable custodian of sensitive nuclear technology. Yes, Iran is a revisionist state that tends to disrespect international norms, but it can nevertheless be a suitable adherent to various protocols in terms of proliferation. So that you have to continuously use the phrase, yes, but it doesn't matter. And that has always been very unusual about arms control approach. A joint plan of action that you mentioned has one particularly problematic provision to it, namely that it suggests the final agreement that is negotiated will have a sunset clause. It will have an expiration date. Ali Khamenei recently mentioned that he wants to build up to 190,000 centrifuges. After an expiration of sunset clause, which Iranians wanted to be 5 to 7 years, he can build 190,000 centrifuges with impunity. He can build a heavy water reactor with impunity. He can build 1.5 million centrifuges with impunity. And he can upgrade those to level of high advancement and high velocity centrifuges. In essence, Iran can become a nuclear weapon state with alacrity.
Yes, but thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We go now to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. Thanks to our witnesses. Picking up on your last statement there, Dr. Takei, would it be better if the United States simply disengaged and announced we're no longer talking to Iran about its nuclear development program?
No, I don't think that's true at all. I think this process of negotiations has been helpful. I think an alternative to the deficient arms control agreement is a better arms control agreement.
Okay, of course. And in a perfect world, it's even better. But given the fact that our two nations haven't really even talked to each other for a long time, you know, trying to break the ice and so that we kind of get a little bit comfortable with each other's styles and where we're coming from would kind of make sense in a negotiating posture, would it not?
I don't have any objections to the diplomatic process.
Do you think that the Phase 1 interim agreement suitably meets that need?
I think the joint plan of action has some constructive dimensions to it, and I think it had some aspects to it which were unwise, particularly the sunset clause.
Do we have, you know, Ronald Reagan popularized the Russian phrase, "Do very no provere," trust but verify. How would you assess that level of trust between the two countries, and what are the mechanisms we need to be able to have sufficient trust to go forward?
Well, I would suggest in terms of arms control, we should negotiate an agreement whose restrictions are permanent and not subject to an expiration clause. And that way the program can remain limited and therefore subject to intrusive verification that can monitor compliance. Upon expiration of sunset clause, Iran will have an industrial-sized nuclear program, and persistent diversion of nuclear resources from an industrial-sized nuclear program are difficult to detect, irrespective of inspection modality.
Do you see any kind of cleavage between the Rouhani government and the Supreme Leader on this subject, and how might that affect the negotiations for a permanent agreement?
I have only access to their public commentary, public speeches, and what they say to their audiences. And in that particular sense, Congressman, I don't notice too many cleavages between the Supreme Leader and his president on the nuclear issue. Their style of representation is different, but on the nuclear issue, I have not detected the cleavages that are suggested.
Is there reason to believe that there's an awareness in Tehran, in governing circles, that this really is a pretty important issue existentially for Iran, that whatever your desire for the symbolism and the prestige and all that, this is potentially a direct threat to Iran and its future, and the stakes are so high that you actually have to get serious. I mean, you're going to have to weigh just how important nuclear development is to you, or that is to say the development of a fissionable material for a bomb versus your very future. How would you assess that awareness in Tehran? Because I think that's also key to the posture in the negotiating settlement and how we respond to perceived sincerity or lack thereof.
I think during his tenure as Supreme Leader, which began in 1989, which makes Ali Khamenei one of the longest-serving leaders in the Middle East, the tragedy of Ali Khamenei, which has become Iran's tragedy, is that he has persistently subordinated national interests to ideological compulsions. And at this particular point, I think there are some in the system that recognize the necessity of having a nuclear program, but also the importance of reviving the economy. That particular balance doesn't seem entirely obvious in the way he talks about the nuclear issue. What he says in his private counsels, I have no access to. I only know what he says to his audiences.
Yeah. And do you think, some people see Rouhani genuinely having evolved and creating some political space, frankly, between the government and the Supreme Leader on this and some other issues. Others say it's just illusory. Rouhani comes right out of the leadership circles.
Well, he has certainly been part of the leadership for a long time, and he's been part of the nuclear program for a long time. As early as 1980s, he was one of the officials responsible for procuring nuclear material. So he's been involved in it for a long time, and he has committed himself to nuclear advancement for a long time. I think the way he looks at the nuclear program is trying to situate it in the larger context of Iranian needs. However, that doesn't seem to be the case with those who he has to interlocutor with.
Dr. Sachs, in the brief time I have left, did you want to comment? And then I'm done.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I think we should point out that the very real dangers of the Iranian nuclear program, ones that Israelis and others are extremely concerned about, are true with a deal to a certain degree. They are certainly true without a deal. And so the questions of a deal are very important on exactly how they are phrased, what kind of modalities there are for inspections and others. But the lack of a deal, I would just caution, does not solve our problem by any means.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Modell, I didn't mean to discriminate against you. I've just run out of time.
Okay, we go to...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly. Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this very important hearing. Dr. Takei, let me ask you, page 2 of your testimony, you mentioned how, and this is your quote, in Khamenei's depiction, America is a crestfallen imperial state hastily retreating from the region. Whatever compunctions Tehran may have had about American power greatly diminished with the spectacle over Syria, where Washington's red lines were erased with the same carelessness that they were initially drawn. Could you elaborate on it? That's a very strong statement, and how much of that do you think might be true? But impression or perception sometimes is as important, particularly in the eyes of a mischievous actor like Iran. Secondly, I would like to ask you, you did point out on page 6 about human rights would have to assume a high place in our negotiations. Iran must be pressed to honor international norms on treatment of its citizens. I have raised with Secretary Kerry on several occasions and other representatives from the administration my disappointment that human rights were not, at least in part, integrated in the negotiations on the nuclear issue. And in mid-June, just June 18th, I had a hearing on human rights in North Korea. And former Special Envoy Andrew Natsios to Sudan, but also the chairman of the North Korean Human Rights Committee, pointed out that in the six-party talks, we left it out there, and when they collapsed with total, in totality, we had nothing when it came to human rights. And, you know, we've raised Saeed Abedini, Amir Hekmati, and Robert Levinson time and time again and said, make that a part. Your thoughts on that, and any other who would like to speak to that?
On the first point, I think the Supreme Leader has given two speeches, most recently July 7th that the chairman mentioned, where he called for 190,000 centrifuges potentially, where he has discounted the possibility of American military strike, explicitly and directly. So he no longer fears the notion that the United States has all its options on the table. At least that's what he tells his audiences, and he seems very comfortable with the notion that his state is no longer going to be subject to American military retribution. Israelis I can't speak to because he hasn't spoken to it. As far as human rights, as you recall, Congressman, my colleague Mark Lagon and I have come and seen you and seen Congressman Deutsch about establishing a Human Rights Commission to essentially bring greater legislative focus on this issue. In previous arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union, the issue of human rights was brought up. That doesn't necessarily mean that agreement was contingent or linked to that, but nevertheless it was brought up by George Shultz and others in negotiating with the Soviet Union. Similarly, I think could be happening. Human rights concerns tend to come from the legislative branch. The executive branch tends to be very hesitant about incorporating human rights in its diplomacy. The Human Rights Bureau in the State Department was essentially conceived during Henry Kissinger's time, and there's nobody less concerned about human rights than Henry Kissinger. And it was essentially because of legislative pressure. So if there is going to be human rights discussion in nuclear diplomacy and international diplomacy, that initiative has to come from the Hill.
Yes.
Congressman, I could just say a word on that. When Rouhani was elected, one of the things that he said, and this was, of course, in collaboration with the Supreme Leader, was he had a sort of a three-phased approach. One was the immediate urgency, contending with the immediate urgency of repairing the economy. I mean, that first and foremost was on the top of the agenda of everybody. Once he did that, it was about shoring up all the support, shoring up the power of the regime itself. And then, if they got around to it, it was about going and starting to answer some of the questions about human rights. Now, of course, we've seen a 3- or 4-fold increase in human rights-related abuses since Rouhani has taken office. The other point I would make, too, you know, when you look at the type of international inspection and verification and monitoring regime that you're going to have to create in the aftermath of an agreement, I think people need to keep in mind something that it's taken the Iranians maybe 10 or 15 years, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, to build up an extremely intricate global apparatus for evading sanctions. And you know, the idea that we can sign an agreement, think that we're going to be able to figure out all of the military dimensions, figure out every way in which they're proliferating, I think is naive. And we better start thinking very soon about how we're going to actually come up with a new containment strategy for doing things like that. And when we talk about, you know, the GCC partners and our allies, you know, I think those are enduring bilateral security partnerships. I don't think that there is any jointness to be, you know, to be really taken seriously on the part of the GCC countries. But they are shaken by the fact that they're going to be facing a nuclear Iran. The global multilateral containment strategy that we need to come up with is critical at this point in time.
Thank you. I see I'm out of time. I do have additional questions. I'll submit it for the record. Thank you.
Without objection, we'll go to Mr. David Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your very important testimony. I want to just begin, Dr. Dekava, with the statement that you made about, you know, a better arms control agreement is preferred over a deficient one, which I think everyone agrees with. But to focus for a moment on the sunset clause, is it your assessment that the Iranians think at the conclusion of that sunset clause that there is likely to be, or before the conclusion of the sunset clause, there's likely to be an engagement with the United States and the other partners about an extension of that agreement? Or is it your sense that they think once it's over, all bets are off and they can robustly proceed with their nuclear weapons program?
The notion that once sunset clause is expired and Iran is treated as any other member of the NPT and therefore can expand its nuclear resources and installations according to its own determination is something that the Supreme Leader has said, is something that Iran's chief negotiator Abbas Araghchi has said as well.
Does anyone have a different view of that? Okay. I'd like to next turn to the destabilizing impact of Iran in Iraq. And I apologize if you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but I'd like any of the witnesses to comment what you think Iran's goals are in Iraq today, and whether or not the Iranian interests are aligned tightly with the Maliki government, and what is the likely impact of Iran's ongoing engagement in Iraq over the long term.
Congressman, thanks for the question. Everything that I've seen is that Iran is desperately trying to keep Maliki in place. They've benefited tremendously by having him in place over the last decade. They don't want him to go away, and if they do, because if he does go away, what comes next? They're not really sure. I think that there are certain Iranians, pragmatic-minded Iranians, who look at the way Maliki has failed miserably in leading Iraq over the last 10 years, and asking themselves why Maliki didn't do a better job of governing, governing over Sunnis and Kurds. But they're desperately trying to keep him there. They're desperately trying to keep the Kurds from breaking away. But I think their long-term interest is stability, and it's continuing to build the base of support that they have. But the problem with the base of support that they're building is that it's mainly comprised of Shia militia forces. And those Shia militia forces, as we know, are not loyal to the government in any way whatsoever. So if you're ever going to hope for some long-term healing of the sectarian divide in that country and the brutal fighting that's going on, that's not the way to do it. So they're not really part of the long-term solution, to be honest.
Dr. Sachs?
I think this touches on a very severe problem that Iran has that Ray raised earlier. Iran, as the major Shia power, would very much like to present itself not as a Shia power, simply because the vast majority of Muslims around the world are Sunni. And so it would much prefer to present itself as part of this world, as a leading power in this world, rather than a Shia one. The animosity towards Israel is part of that. The best way to curry favor with people who disagree with you on the Shia-Sunni divide is to adopt the same enemy that many Muslims unfortunately perceive in Israel. In Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, elsewhere, Iran is finding itself, however, on the side of what is becoming more and more a sectarian divide, something which the adversaries of Iran, not Israel, but Saudi Arabia and others, are seeing very much as a sectarian divide. I think this is the common theme now of the Middle East and really overshadows most of what we're seeing across the region. It's not necessarily in Iran's interest, but it is very worrisome. I agree with Scott very much. It is very worrisome. It is becoming more and more, partly through Iran's actions, a sectarian divide.
And Dr. Sachs, you mentioned in your written testimony that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, that you believe that the transfer outside of the state or outside of Iran is a long shot. Would you explain kind of what you think argues, from Iran's perspective, why they're likely to do that or not do that? Because obviously their development of a nuclear weapon and then the transfer to an actor outside of Iran is a further complication.
I was quoting the common views in Israel, not necessarily my own, but I do think that by and large it's a long shot. Of course, it's a long shot with huge ramifications. So even if the risk of its happening is low, the damage of it happening would be enormous. The main concern with Iran is whether it itself would use nuclear weapons. And on that, many Israelis and others believe that since it believes Israel has second strike capabilities, and although its goals seem unreasonable, its manner of pursuing them has been rational. And as a rational actor, therefore, you would expect it not to use these nuclear weapons in a mutual assured destruction. It's a very grim reality, one which I very much hope we do not get to, but it may be stable. The transfer to other parties would tie to this as well. The question is whether they could believe with some certainty that they could do this without detection, whether they would believe that Israel would not think that it is them, whether this kind of transfer would get them out of the grim mutual assured destruction logic. It is certainly possible that they would try to do it. I think it is unlikely because the chances of avoiding this kind of mutual assured destruction logic from the Israeli side is low.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is to the panel. How popular are the mullahs in their own country? Are we talking about 10% of the people support them, 20%, 50%? What is the real level of support the mullahs have in their own country?
I think that's very difficult to estimate. However, I would suggest that in aftermath of the 2009 election, the fraudulent election of 2009, that was really a watershed moment when the regime essentially forfeited a considerable amount of its popular legitimacy. The Islamic Republic became more Islamic and less republic. So whatever the popularity it had, which, as you mentioned, was always very marginal, has, in my opinion, diminished considerably after that particular election.
Could I prod you a little bit more? How about giving me just a guesstimate?
Possibly the 10% of the population, but it's a 10% of the population that it can mobilize and bring to the street and essentially dominate in that sense.
All right, and tacit support, another 10% or 20%?
It's very difficult to judge that. I think at this particular point, the regime is quite unpopular because of its performance, because of its ideology, and because of the infamy that has come because of its conduct. I certainly don't think it can survive a plebiscite or a fair election.
Okay, what about our next?
Congressman, I think that you asked one of the most difficult questions. We spent years in the government trying to figure out exactly the answer to that question. And part of the problem with polling in that country is people are afraid to speak their minds, particularly when it's not very delicately done. So to be honest with you, I don't know. But I can tell you, though, a reflection of the fact that you don't, I mean, you may have a significant amount of people there who are unhappy and don't support the mullahs and the regime, but that hasn't translated into a military movement inside that's willing to do what the Green Movement did in 2009.
I'm no expert on Iranian internal affairs, but I would just point out that Iran has a very smart way of going about ruling a country not through democracy, which is to have something that looks sometimes like democracy. These hybrid regimes where there are meaningful elections that have some kind of meaning, but are not truly free, the candidates are, of course, vetted ahead of time. This actually allows for a lot of steam, a lot of vent to go out. It allows people to change some of the policies without undermining the fundamental regime. So even if the hardcore support is very low, we could still find a system that is stable both because of some fear and oppression, but also because there's a smart design to it, much smarter than extreme totalitarian dictatorship.
So let me note for the record, Mr. Chairman, that none of our witnesses were willing to actually put a number down in terms of what they think the level of support for the mullahs. Now, we depend on you guys. You know, this is, you're supposed to be telling us these things. I would suggest that the mullahs are very unpopular with about 90% of the people, but I don't know. That's, I was hoping you were going to give me some guidance on that. But we do know that among the people of Iran, there are not just Persians. What percentage of the population is Persian?
I think it's, the last time I looked, I think it was 67, 68%.
So you have about 40% or so, 30 to 40%?
30 to 40% that are Azeris and others, Kurds and others.
Kurds, Baluch, people such as that. Is there, the popularity among the mullahs, among the minorities, I imagine, would be even less than among the young Persians. Is there any reason why, I mean, I have, frankly, when we talk about Iran, I hear all kinds of analysis of the power flow and the dynamics of the Iranian regime itself. I rarely hear any specific suggestions of how we get rid of it. And I would suggest, as I have in the past, that we need to be looking at the opposition. If it's only got a 10%, which we don't know, we're not even willing to speculate, that support level, there should be lots of people there, including those people who are non-Persian, who we might be able to mobilize against the regime. But I don't think we've been doing that, have we?
No, we have not. Not at all, to be honest with you. And I would like to make one comment on 2009. So when 2009 came in the aftermath of the presidential elections, as you recall, and the Green Movement started, and as it grew, the supreme leader and the regime completely underestimated it. And once they did realize the dimension of the problem, the supreme leader said, okay, now we have to come together, and when we're talking about a whole of government solution to something, this is exactly what they did, and they cleared out Evin prison, and they got everybody together, and all sort of interagency differences over there disappeared as they very effectively dismantled that movement. But the key thing is this: it was in 2009, as it started to gain momentum, that some of the leaders of that movement, and this is publicly known, were reaching out to the United States and saying, what do we do? Where do we go? What, can you give us any guidance? And they weren't necessarily looking to overthrow the regime. That was never their stated goal. But it was a crack in the, it was a potential real crack in the foundation that we could have assisted, and we did not do that.
We've been waiting for other people to make those cracks. We should start helping making them ourselves. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We go now to Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for sharing your insights and thoughts. Dr. Takei, let me start with you. And I think as you said, one of the real concerns about any type of negotiation to an agreement with Iran is trying to achieve a durable agreement with an unreliable partner. And like you, I share the concern of the discussion of a term, in particular the idea of a discussion of a term in a number of years. I think it should be at the very least generations if we can't get the permanent agreement. But more broadly, do you think it's possible for a deal with Iran, no matter how well structured it is on the document, to be effectively enforced?
I think you have to kind of think about the importance of nuclear capability within Iran's larger regional policy. At a time when it has an aggressive regional policy, it makes sense for it to have nuclear capability. In the Gulf today, there's an imbalance of conventional power. The Saudis and others have greater conventional strength simply because they have access to the American military supplies. And Iran does not have an access to international military supplies and doesn't have an indigenous arms industry. So the way Iranians have tried to affect that imbalance of power is by developing unconventional capabilities, missiles and unconventional weapons, chemical weapons. And so nuclear weapons fit into that particular equation. And so long as Iran has hegemonic aspiration, it will make sense for it to have nuclear capability. As Hassan Rouhani said in his memoirs, he's published 4, he's very self-reflective. The last one he said, look, he always talks about it as a peaceful nuclear weapon, but he said the problem with our peaceful nuclear weapon is it got caught before it reached its objectives. So since then, they had to balance nuclear sophistication and enlargement with economic contraction. And that's been the struggle. During the Ahmadinejad era, of course, they put privilege on nuclear enlargement. Iran, as a matter of revolutionary ideology, the Islamic Republic, as a matter of revolutionary ideology, tends to suspect international norms as unfair and international organizations as conspiring against it. That includes the IAEA and the UN Security Council, whose resolutions it has rejected as politically contrived. Right. So it makes it a less reliable of an arms control partner than the example that is often cited, namely the Soviet Union.
Let me turn to Dr. Sachs. Because in the context of Iran looking to bolster its capacity, hegemonic capacity, with unconventional, you talk about the full spectrum of Iranian activity. Does the support of Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, fit within the context of that, trying to extend their reach?
Well, the problem, of course, with negotiations around that is what can you do within the context of negotiations? So the problem, I think, for many Israelis is indeed, as you've mentioned before, that these negotiations don't include all these different aspects, the full spectrum, as you say. The problem is, of course, whether or not you can get a deal in all of that. The question is the capability, even through sanctions, which were very stringent, can those sanctions bring about Iranian capitulation on everything, or is there a chance of bringing it about the nuclear issue? I don't know that we can on the nuclear issue, and it certainly looks like we're not going to have it by July 20th, although never say never. But the chances of having it on the full spectrum are even lower. And so the very difficult dilemma, I think, from a policy question is, does one opt for trying to go for something which one cannot achieve, or does one focus very, very concretely on the specific issues that maybe one can? The spectrum remains, though, and this is, I think, a very important point. Even if there is a deal on the nuclear issue, not only will the nuclear issue still be relevant and important the day after, in fact, it will be more important to keep a watchful eye, the other issues that we've been raising here today will be perhaps even more important with Iran freed from sanctions, or most of the sanctions at least, and free to do many other things that it can't do at the moment.
I agree with you, and I know last month this committee passed unanimously the Hezbollah sanctions bill that would limit or prohibit their access to international banking and thwart some of that relationship. I'm hopeful that that full House and then the Senate will pass that this month. Dr. Moto, as you look at what's happening in the region and the threat of holding Iran to account on the full spectrum, on their nuclear program, and you talked about the inherent need that we have to understand their potential military dimension, their weaponization, their delivery systems. An agreement that just focuses on enrichment, how do you see that? What risks do you see that that leaves open going forward?
Well, I think the difference, for me, I see risks no matter what kind of a deal we strike, to be honest with you. Because I think that the time, I think somebody's mentioned it here, one of the panelists mentioned it here, that time is key, 3, 5, 7 years, it doesn't matter, because when that time expires, the revolutionary, the conventional agenda is not going to stop. And if you truly believe that they're after nuclear weapons, why can't they suspend that? They have a long-term vision here. That why can't they suspend that for 3 to 5 years and pick up where they left off? Another thing I would mention, too, in the context of these negotiations, it shouldn't be surprising that they're putting limitations, the Iranians, that is, on the breadth of these negotiations. They've very clearly spelled out their own red lines. They won't even talk about ballistic missiles, in the context of these negotiations. Neither will they talk about rapprochement with the West or even human rights. So I think regardless of I mean, I'm hoping for the best deal possible, but I think you need at least 10 to 15 years to be able to build up the trust that it's going to be required, and the ability, and it's not just the trust, it's not just, good behavior over time. It's for us to build up the mechanisms we need globally to figure out if they're cheating. And we can't rely solely on the IAEA to do that.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I'll just say that against a regime that thinks in millennium and carries forward a long-term vision, talking about years or decades just doesn't seem sufficient. And with that, I'll yield back.
We go to Mr. Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing this morning. As the recent crisis in Iraq began to unfold, the administration initially welcomed Iranian engagement in an effort to quickly resolve the issue, although many experts cautioned against such policies, and I would put myself in that latter category. I think we have to be very wary of any involvement with Iran, but I'd be interested to hear the panel's take on what's Iran's strategy with respect to Iraq? What are they trying to accomplish? What should we be particularly wary of? What dangers are they, either the short or long term, in rubbing elbows with Iran here, maybe thinking we're getting something now that we want, but long term we've made a deal with the devil here. Mr. Takai?
I think the objectives of the Iranian government at this point, and have been since 2003, to consolidate the power of the Shia majority. They are essentially aware that some degree of Sunni participation could help, and the civil war is not necessarily in their interest because it will have spillover effects. In terms of the Maliki government, they probably have their dissatisfactions with the way Prime Minister Maliki has ruled, but overall their approach is, in the middle of a crisis, you don't change horses. That was the case in Assad as well, in a sense that they didn't want Assad to be dislodged and replaced with another member of the Alawite family. So you go to war with the army you have, in essence. In long term, essentially to remove Iraq from the councils of Sunni Arab states, have a weakened Iraq, Shia-dominated Iraq, that to some extent relies on Iran for its objectives and commerce.
Thank you. Would any of the other members like to touch? Mr. Medell?
The only thing I would add to that is I think we shouldn't underestimate how many Iraqis are against the idea of Iran's influence in that country growing. So when we're reading reports here that may sound like we're sort of dovetailing, in terms of dealing with ISIS, Iranians are working against that cause. We want to work against that cause. I think a lot of Iraqis are very wary about the growth of Iran's role in that country. So I would be cautious about saying that it certainly is. I think it's more divisive over time than anything else.
Thank you. Dr. Sachs, anything you'd like to add? Okay, thank you. At the recent talks over Iran's nuclear program in Vienna, Secretary Kerry mentioned that the international community needs tangible reassurance that Iran will not move to quickly develop nuclear weapons. How can the administration develop an agreement to realistically prevent the Iranians from pursuing the weapons program, which I think, quite frankly, whatever we do, they're bound to determine to accomplish this. But I know the administration continues to believe that there's some hope there. How do you think a long-term nuclear agreement would affect Iran's interactions with terrorist groups in the region, for example? And what impact would a long-term nuclear agreement have on Iran's ability to influence its neighbors in the region? And whoever would like to take it is welcome to do that.
I would say that I tend to agree with you. I think regardless of the type of agreement we see, they've got an agenda to cross that threshold and weaponize. And I think that we're going to, in terms of figuring out, well, what is it we need to do to figure out how to build a global apparatus to give ourselves the best chance of determining if they're cheating or not, or if they're going to break out. Quite frankly, I think we've had the last decade of realizing, enough time to realize that it's really hard to do these things. There is enough evidence, the U.S. government has collected enough evidence, and its allies over the years, of proliferation networks, but they haven't been criminalized, adequately criminalized. I think that there is a law enforcement aspect to this, and it's not only U.S., but I think it's a global law enforcement aspect to this that needs to be improved, because if we enable ourselves to better pursue law enforcement investigations that are related to nuclear proliferation, it goes hand in hand with figuring out if they're cheating or not. I think that's been a real deficiency.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Sachs.
Well, I think on the central issues that might allow for a reasonable deal, I don't think a good deal is possible, and I agree that there's little chance that it would guarantee no development of nuclear weapons. But certainly the plutonium track, the weaponization aspects of it, and of course enrichment, both in terms of stocks of uranium and stocks that are already there, but also technology and technology that might advance. All these issues are crucial and of course are being raised. Another issue that was raised here today and is more problematic is the issue of delivery systems, of ballistic missiles accurate enough and capable of doing this. And that is very important and perhaps one that might be deficient. And of course, verification is the main issue. The degree to how stringent the verification will be of compliance with this agreement will be crucial. None of this guarantees at all that Iran won't pursue it anyway. I would just caution again that the lack of a deal certainly does not guarantee that either.
Thank you. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Dr. Ami Bera of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, Dr. Takai, you touched on that at present, Iran doesn't have the military capabilities with conventional arsenals compared to Saudi Arabia and others in the region. So, from my perspective, I think how they've tried to level the playing field and that balance of power is through this, through the terror networks and so forth. And in essence, you can almost draw a line from Iran to al-Maliki, now to Assad, to Hezbollah, to Hamas as kind of that destabilizing force. And if you think about some of the proxies, I also, I would be curious on your thought there.
I think that's right. In 2006 and 2007, the current head of the Revolutionary Guards, General Jafari, before that, he was a kind of a strategic planner, and he came up with something called mosaic defense, namely that increasingly the United States will not invade another Middle Eastern country. So the question is, how do you adjust your defense posture in order to advance your objectives given that? And essentially, he came out with the ideas of asymmetrical defense, reliance on missile technology, proxy forces. And it was at that time that the role of Hezbollah in particular changed in Iranian calculations. Hezbollah was no longer a political party with a military apparatus that Iranians tried to have a greater say in the Lebanese society, but essentially became an auxiliary of the Iranian force. And you see that manifestation particularly in Syria. So that's essentially the way they think about their defense. And unconventional weapons are essentially part of that.
And in your words, Khamenei puts the ideologic interest ahead of the national interest. And right. I think in your testimony, is it accurate to say he sees the United States as a country in retreat from the region?
That's right. That's what he says.
So if he's looking at things in that way, and if we look at what's got us to this point, clearly the sanctions have been effective in bringing them to the table. Clearly, the sanctions have been effective in creating some unrest and creating some real issues within the Iranian economy. Doesn't appear to me now's the time for us to step back a little bit, but now's the time for us to actually continue to exert influence.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I think that's right. I would say that whatever leverage we have mobilized with sanctions and other measures have obviously been insufficient to discipline Iran into an agreement should there be an extension past July 20th. As I was trying to suggest to Congressman Connolly, I don't oppose extension of the talks for another 6 months, But I do think the administration has to respond to the question of, what do you think is going to happen in the next 6 months that didn't happen in the previous ones? Right. I think they should answer that question.
Because if we're negotiating with a regime that sees us in retreat, from my perspective, I don't think that's the best position to negotiate from.
I would say at this point, our coercive leverage has not been sufficient to compel an agreement.
Okay, so if, yeah, I guess I'd allow the others if you want to expand on that.
I think I would tend to agree with you on this. The time for retreating on sanctions is wrong. I think that I've seen a number of Iranian leaders talking about it as a strategic opening. And if after the biggest, the most effective sanctions regime we've ever put together isn't compelling them now, after 6 months of negotiations with an economic knife at their throats, to actually really be forthcoming about the single most complex problem, in other words, the possible military dimensions of their program, then the answer is, why are we letting up on sanctions now?
I would agree, and that is not to be construed that we don't continue talking. But let's talk and negotiate from a place of strength. Iran also has, its own issues. Obviously, the challenges that it's facing with the struggling al-Maliki government, with the ISIL in Iraq and the Sunni uprising, with Assad facing his own challenges. So, they certainly have to, in this negotiation, they certainly have to fight a battle on multiple fronts as well. And, again, from a negotiating perspective, I think my message to the administration I do think we need to negotiate from a place of strength. And that doesn't mean we stop talking. It does mean we negotiate from strength. So thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today and spending time with us. I just want to say off the bat, the idea of, and I've heard administration officials talk, Secretary Kerry, in talking about what a potential final deal with Iran would look like. And in no way have they ruled out some level of enrichment. They'll argue that, well, we'll keep it at a very low level of enrichment, so breakout capability takes a long time. And, fine argument to make, except the neighbors don't see it that way. And what I think is also interesting is, as we negotiate in 1, 2, 3 agreements around the world, there's a lot of areas we have denied our best allies the right to enrich. I think of South Korea. I think of the United Arab Emirates. These people that we say we're committed to a nuclear-free Korean peninsula or Arab peninsula, and we don't give them that right. And so to give the biggest enemy of the United States, I would argue, the right to do something that we deny to our best and closest allies will send a tragic message that America can't be trusted by its allies and it's not to be feared by its enemies. And that's something that I fear. I also am a veteran of Iraq and as a pilot there, and I've noticed that it seems like every engagement, whether it's a war, whether it's some low-level engagement in the Middle East that we've been involved in, has somehow had the fingerprints of Iran all over it. And I think of in Iraq. It's estimated now that about half of the men and women that we lost in Iraq were a direct or indirect result of Iran itself, whether it was their EFPs, the technology that they exported to the terrorists in Iraq, or whether it was even in some cases direct intervention. And we've seen that Iran continues to destabilize everywhere. The other question I have, and I'll ask you all to briefly answer this because I have some other questions. When we withdrew from Iraq, in 2003 we went in, we invaded. Iran seemed very eager to work with the United States at that point. When we withdrew after 2011, what message did that send? Pulled all the troops out of Iraq. What message did that send to Iran? If you could just very briefly answer.
I think 2003 did confront Iran with existential threat. We know that now, and particularly with Rouhani's memoirs. I would say the general departure of the United States from the region and general hesitancy has emboldened Iran, and I would actually go back to Syria before that, and then Iraq became successor and affirmative to Syria.
Okay.
No, Congressman, I just second that. I don't have anything to add other than in 2011, I think they viewed it as a strategic victory, to be honest with you. And the U.S. withdrawal out of Afghanistan in the same way.
I think in general, the U.S. certainly has a problem in the Middle East of a perception of its weakness. It rightly or wrongly is perceived that way. Of course, the question is, what kind of investment is the U.S. willing to do to avoid that? And that's a real one.
I think it's interesting to me. I've been studying a little bit recently a lot about the period between World War I and World War II, where the world was war-weary, and they saw this rising threat in Europe, and they did not confront it because of a purveying war weariness. Now, after World War I think the world had a right to be war weary. It lost millions of people, economies of scale destroyed. Today, I hear a lot of, frankly, my colleagues and talking heads talk about a war weariness in the United States of America. And while I understand that some people certainly do experience war weariness, you know, there was no tax increase to fight the wars. Our economy was not changed based on the war in the Middle East. And while we lost too many people, it really pales in comparison to what was lost at the end of World War II, or in World War I and World War II. At the end of World War II, Harry Truman came in and said he didn't look at the American people and say, you're war-weary, we have to leave Europe. He looked at the American people and said, I know you're tired, but the Soviet Union is going to be twice the size as it is today if we leave Europe. And really motivated the American people. And my fear today is that we find ourselves in a situation where we're so eager to leave a period of conflict and warfare that we'll do anything to get out, and we hasten the day when a bigger war is going to happen, whether it's my generation or whether it's generations following me. Last thing I want to touch on, as the situation in Iraq very tragically unfolds, I hear some people say that this is fine, let the caliphate figure out that governing's not easy. Well, they don't see governing like we do. But they say that's great. Let Iran get pulled into a quagmire in Iraq like we did. And I would argue that Iran defines quagmire quite differently than us. We see losing 100 soldiers a month, as tragic as it is, as a quagmire, and Iran does not. What are your all's thoughts on the idea of letting Iran get drug into a quagmire and how that would be?
The same argument that was made about Syria. Somehow Iranians can manage in these convoluted situations with less costs and less casualties than we do, simply because of their high reliance on proxies.
I would just reiterate what I said before. I think that the longer time goes on with Iran being involved in Iraq, particularly militarily, the worse things get, because they're going to rely on building up proxy forces there that are not necessarily loved by significant amounts of the population. So I think it's a negative force over time.
Just briefly, I think we should also be very worried about what happens to these regions, whether or not Iran gets caught in a quagmire. The ramifications for these countries, Syria, Iraq, or others, is huge as well.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who is the ranking member of the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to just mention something for the record. I think it's absurd to think that the American people would be all gung-ho for another war in the Middle East if only we had a president with a different personality. No one thought that President Bush was a retiring violet, but in the last year of his presidency, I noticed no popular groundswell for an American invasion of Iran. I don't sense that today. I don't think it relates to whether, you know, what the personality of the president is. I will say that under this administration, we have paid a significant economic and diplomatic price for strengthening our sanctions on Iran, whereas in the Bush administration, we didn't pass a single law of significance because the president prevented it, and we didn't enforce any of the laws we had then. So at least this president is willing to cause us to pay a diplomatic and economic price to control Iran, if not a price in the loss of American troops on the ground. Dr. Sachs, you've got obviously the Shiite-Sunni split. Can Iran, Al-Qaeda, and this new Islamic State aspire to be the leaders of extremist Islam? Can Iran aspire to that role, or are they limited to the role of a protector of Shiites worldwide?
My understanding is they are very limited, and they're especially limited in the context of this conflagration. So if you look at in previous years, the Shia-Sunni divide was not necessarily that salient. Differences in identity were not necessarily expressed. Other issues, national and other, were much stronger. But in the context of the Middle East today, where this Sunni-Shia divide is so strong, it is hard to see Iran really taking leadership in the Arab world. And this is something that is quite different than in the past, where they and Hezbollah, for example, held the mantle of fighting Israel.
I see that Russia seems more positively disposed to Assad and Tehran. Is this because they have a very small Shiite population in their own country and they're near abroad, and so they don't see Iran as an ideological threat, but they do see extremist Sunni groups as an ideological threat?
I don't know, sir. I doubt it is about a preference between Shia and Sunni. I think it is a very strong Russian preference for stability at any cost, almost. And so they would rather not have extremist groups, certainly, something that they fear in their own periphery and even in their own federation. But they also have a strong preference just for stability, and both of these things lead to support for Assad. There are other issues as well, but both of these things lead in the same direction.
Dr. Takei, how bad is the economic situation in Iran now? And if you could write one more sanctions law, what would it be? And how dependent is Iran, I'll give you a hint on the second question with my third, on spare parts from Europe and other American allies? If an elevator breaks down in a building in Tehran, can they fix it without getting a part flown in from Germany?
In terms of the economy, according to the IMF statistics, which they rely on the Iranian central bank, so who knows how reliable they are, IMF suggests that Iran's economy is likely to grow by about 2%.
That's better than ours. And can you also talk about the black market value of their currency, because that's something the Iranians can't
Right,
fix.
they had a liquidity crisis, but I think they have managed it. They have taken the hits on that. It's a country that still relies a great deal on spare parts, as you suggested, but increasingly they're beginning to have deficient spare parts from China and other, developing alternative sources and alternative measures to get their economy going. But it's very much still a stagnant economy in a sense that economic opportunity is having a difficult time keeping up with demographics.
And if you could write one additional sanctions law that would cripple or at least hurt the Iranian economy over the next 5 years, what would it be?
Well, the key would be to essentially limit their export of oil, and that they only have 5, 6 customers now, so that's going to be difficult to do with the Chinese, but perhaps there's more leverage with South Koreans and Japanese.
The real question here is not whether we're willing to have tens of thousands of Americans die on the ground, but whether we're willing to tell the Chinese that they have to choose between Iran and the United States as a business partner. The toughest adversary we may have in this is Walmart.
Right. I think it'll be difficult to get Iranian exports down, but that's where the soft spot is.
Gotcha.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your comments. Dr. Sachs, you had mentioned how the Israelis view the threat of a nuclear Iran, and I think that you painted a picture that they were a little bit more accepting than maybe my understanding was going to be. I mean, historian Bernard Lewis, one of the most knowledgeable historians of Islamic thinking, said that to people like Ali Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, the former president, the mutual assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement for them, because it serves to essentially hasten the messianic process, the return of the 12th Imam. So what kind of purchase does that have in Israeli thinking right now as they look at the threat?
To clarify, I certainly do not mean to suggest that the Israeli government views this in the nuanced way that I suggested. The Israeli government's position is very clear, that is, that only zero enrichment, zero enriched uranium stock, only they are acceptable. There are some very senior people from the center of the Israeli security establishment that view it slightly more nuanced. They too, though, again, don't think very differently from the Israeli administration. They simply think that if it was very low enrichment levels and if the verification was very stringent, perhaps it would be livable, perhaps it would be better than a situation with no agreement at all. But again, the differences are quite small in Israel. The diversity of opinion is quite small. On the issue of rationality, there is quite interesting difference. Some suggest, exactly as you quoted Bernard Lewis, saying that the Islamic Republic is inherently irrational. The Prime Minister of Israel has said this as well. And in that case, they cannot be deterred by any of these means. But there are others very central, in fact, in the cabinet itself, who have a slightly different view, who say that even the Soviet Union had, not messianic in the religious sense, but messianic in the utopian sense, aspirations for the world, and yet they could be deterred. It's a very grim reality. It's not one we should hope for. The Cold War was certainly not a picnic, but it may be more stable than the alternative.
Yeah, I would just say Iran's behavior to us is clearly irrational, but if you accept some of the premises that the regime is based on, for example, Rafsanjani was quoted about a decade ago saying, look, we could wipe out 5 million Jews with one bomb, and yeah, we know that they would respond, and he's just doing this calculation kind of matter-of-factly, and they probably would kill 15 million Iranians, but you know what? I mean, that's really an acceptable sacrifice. There's over 1 billion Muslims, and so I think that some of the calculations they make to us would obviously be irrational, but if you believe in that apocalyptic view of Shiite Islam, then it may be something, and that's why I think it's so dangerous to allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. This is not like the Soviet Union, who was a very hostile regime. At the end of the day, they were atheists. If they got blown up, there was nothing at the light at the end of the tunnel for them. Let me ask you, or I can actually, any of the panelists, we've been talking about on this committee the role of ISIS in Iraq and what's happening there, and I know Iran is involved, Quds forces there. I'm trying to get a handle on exactly how involved they are. Would we see more Iranian involvement if, say, ISIS was threatening the Shiite holy sites? I know they've talked about they wanted to actually destroy those. I take it that the Iranian regime would view that as a vital national interest of their country and that they may be willing to do even more than they have. What are the panelists' views on that?
I think that they've already that's already been in the front of their minds, and when they're trying to determine what's their calculus for involvement, for figuring out the extent of their involvement in Iraq. When they were looking at the most important Shiite shrines and protecting them. That's been on their minds for a long time. I also think that you're going to see, if you start to see the ISIS moving further east and further south, that you're going to continue to see a buildup of more regular Iranian forces. Right now, they're relying considerably on proxies and the integration of those proxies into regular Iraqi military units. And
you basically have the Shiite militia groups, and then you have there's a Quds force commander, I think, and so you have the Quds force with kind of Sotorist militia groups that are the main source of kind of anti-ISIS opposition at this point.
You have several different variations. You have Shia militia groups fighting on their own. You have Shia militia groups that are partially integrated into Iraqi regular forces. You have, in which you have, IRGC Quds Force officers overseeing those Shia militia groups in both roles. And you have Shia militia groups integrating into Iraqi regular military uniforms. You have others where they're separated out. You have joint units with the Kurds. I mean, the Iranians are doing everything they can to build up a large proxy force, but in it's a multifaceted effort.
Thank you. My time has expired. I would just say I think that we're running a very, very serious risk of walking into a bad deal here with the administration and what they've been doing. And, I think Congress really needs to speak out. A bad deal will be worse than not having any deal at all. And I yield back the balance.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panelists. I'd like to take the conversation a little different direction. There's been a lot of talk about the nuclear negotiations, what a deal looks like, how much leverage we have, and what would happen if Iran, if there's no deal, or if, looking ahead, if Iran had a nuclear weapon, if they went to break out at the expiration of a term of whatever the deal is. I'd actually like to look at it a different way. What, if you could talk about what Iran's goals are with respect to its support for terror, what are its priorities, and with respect to the nuclear deal, we spend a lot of time talking about how dangerous these terrorist groups supported by Iran would be if Iran had nuclear weapons, but what could Iran do with the immense amount of resources that it would possess if it struck a deal and foreign investment came pouring in, the economy turned around, its currency rebounded, inflation was, all the other things that would come from a deal for them. What could they do with that in their support of terror? Where would they focus, and what would that mean for us?
Historically, Iran's principal strategic arena of concern has been the Persian Gulf. So in essence, you will see them, I think, with additional resources being much more involved in Iraq and the Gulf states at the beginning level. And then there is that sort of organic attachment to Hezbollah and to anti-Palestinian and Palestinian rejectionist group, but they would be essentially in that sense. The regime with additional resources would also have an opportunity to essentially legitimize itself domestically and perhaps craft an agreement with its population similar to the Chinese. Namely that in response to political acquiescence, you get material rewards and vulgar nationalism. So it might essentially have a new national compact with the population that could perhaps contribute to the regime's longevity.
In other words, population says, we can live essentially, economically, we can live Western lives. You do whatever it is you're going to do.
Separate state from society.
Right. Dr. Sachs?
Well, I'd say that in tension to what I said before, the Iranians do seem to be invested very heavily in Shia populations abroad, although they don't want to present themselves as leaders of the Shia. When in fact you look at where they invest their resources, their considerable resources, it tends to be there, partly because that's where they can find the allies. So you'd expect that Lebanon, Syria, which not only Shia but non-Sunni groups, would have vast support, even bigger than they do today, and that would be very considerable. In the Persian Gulf itself, one of the biggest concerns of Saudi Arabia is the fact that Saudi Arabia itself has a very sizable Shia minority, and in fact it's located just in the most strategic area of where the oil is. And so this would be extremely dangerous from their perspective. Of course, Bahrain is Shia majority. From the Israeli perspective, Iranian activity already, and even more so if it had more resources, is very low cost to Iran. Iran can fight Israel by proxy. It sends Hezbollah to do things, it arms PIJ and Hamas to do things, but Iran itself does not suffer the consequences. And so it gains two things. First, it fights this holy war that it imagines, and the second is it gains a deterrent against Israel for any possible operation. The debate I described earlier about Hezbollah, whether it will operate on the behest of Iran, is a very serious one from Israel, thinking that if worse comes to worse and Israel has to act conventionally, would Hezbollah get involved? Some in the beginning thought maybe not, and as I said, the Syrian civil war just proved that of course they would do so.
I'd like to narrow it down though. So instead of talking about what Iran would do as the leader of the Shia around the world, be specific. Which terrorist groups that it supports would it like to support more, and what would those groups do with the resources?
I would say certainly Hezbollah.
Right.
Hezbollah has already been a very generous beneficiary of Iranian. After 2006, when Hezbollah misadventured into war, the Iranians essentially helped rebuild much of its infrastructure. So that would be different. And also various Shia militia groups that Iran would have to use in order to manipulate the politics of that country, and potentially in Saudi Arabia. It's important to recognize, and I know my time's short, in many Middle Eastern countries, their internal populations are a national security threat. Saudi Arabia views its own citizens of Shia belief as a national security threat because they can make common cause with an external threat. So there's a lot of opportunities for mischief.
I would agree with everything you said. The only thing I would add in terms of what specific groups would be supported in the focus, I think it would stay mainly within the region. But I would also say it's important to look at the ways in which Iran right now is actually doing some of that, preparing the groundwork for that. So when you look at Iraq, when you look at Iranian-supported forces, particularly proxy forces that it's using in Iraq, you have Bahrainis, you have Yemenis, you have Afghans, you have a number of others. They've been cultivating these relationships for a long time. I think it would be an expansion of those relationships, particularly when they leave Iraq and they go back home. They're going back home and they have stronger foundations of power for the regime.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. How does Iran's involvement with Iraq in dealing with the conflict with the Islamic State, how does that affect our negotiation with the nuclear deal with Iran?
Well, at this particular point, I don't think it has an impact on it in a sense that Supreme Leader said he doesn't want to negotiate with the United States on this issue, and Secretary Hagel has said the same thing. I think both parties are trying to keep this segregated from the larger regional conflict that they have.
Mr. Modell? Okay, same. All right. You know, the purpose of this negotiation or our sanctions up to this point was to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Sitting in this room right here, we've had meeting after meeting after meeting that says Iran is going to get a nuclear weapon. I mean, 6 to 8 months, we had meetings, they said they're 6 to 8 months from having 4 to 5 nuclear weapons. That was a year ago, so I can only assume with the experts sitting here, they told us the truth, so we should assume they probably have that. Yet the sanctions that we had didn't prevent that. So can we realistically think that new sanctions or a new negotiation is going to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons, especially if there's a sunset clause? The reports I've read that said it's going to be 3 to 5 years from now when those phase away is what Iran wants. I mean, are we going to prevent them from ever having a nuclear weapon?
Well, I would say in aftermath of expiration of sunset clause, and I think the 5+1, including the United States, would like to have a longer sunset clause, maybe a decade. After that, Iran has a right, as any other NPT member, to have an industrial-sized nuclear program similar to Japan's, and that essentially gives it the ability to manufacture a large arsenal of nuclear weapons on short notice.
Okay, so if we're going in that direction, would it not be better for us to prepare for that and the rest of the world to prepare for that instead of wasting all this time trying to prevent something that they're going to do regardless if there's an agreement or not, because they have shown that they're not trustworthy and they're going to do this anyway. So why don't we prepare for that and prepare the rest of the world and negotiate conditions on how another nation acts towards another? And I know we have treaty after treaty after treaty, but yet that day is coming, and I think it would behoove us to focus on that.
I think that's right. I'm not quite sure if it's inevitable for Iran to get a nuclear weapon, because I think there are things that can happen between now and then. But I do think one of the reasons why we embrace negotiations and the negotiating process is because we don't want to ask the questions that you're asking. Is what if this issue is not susceptible to diplomatic mediation? And once you answer that question, what does the day after look like?
Well, that's just it. It's like, but yet somebody's got to tell the emperor he doesn't have any clothes on. I mean, we all see it. We see it coming. So I think it would behoove us as a nation. And this, I want to bring this up because the subject of this meeting is Iran's destabilizing role in the Middle East. How is our foreign policy viewed? I mean, we've had ambassadors in from all kinds of Middle Eastern countries in the last 2 weeks. They said the view of America is at the lowest point they've ever seen. Our credibility is gone. They don't know what we stand for. It's like we have a compass like Jack Sparrow in the Pirates of the Caribbean. It's got a broken compass, and they don't know what our policies stand for. Our credibility has been lost. And you were, Dr. Sachs, you were talking about, you said the other parts of the world view us as weak. Explain that. Is that militarily? Is that our foreign policy? Or is that the direction or the will to stand up and do what we view as right?
I think in part it's a pendulum. I think it's very strong in the Middle East, perhaps stronger than elsewhere. But I think in the Middle East in particular, it's a bit of a pendulum. After the years of the previous administration, where there was a very involved U.S. policy with boots on the ground in massive numbers, we've seemed to have swung in the other direction. And the reaction in the Middle East has been severe. It has been one that America has lost its resolve. They have taken the declinist literature seriously, which is a mistake, I think. And the result, of course, is that they now view the United States as not as resolved as it was in the past. I would just add one point about the possibility of what we might do in international coalition. Sustaining the sanctions, which the Congress has been very important in installing, this demands also cooperation with the coalition. And to keep this coalition going, there is some utility in these negotiations, even above and beyond the possibility of what a deal might bring.
Right, but yet to have effective sanctions, you're going to have to tell China what to do, and we're not going to be able to do that. And as far as boots on the ground, the only place I want our military's boots on the ground is in the United States of America. And I would like at some point for you guys, if you could submit a reset of our foreign policy of what you think we should be doing in America as far as dealing with the rest of the world, because what we've done over the last 30, 40 years, it ain't working real well. Thank you.
The gentleman's time's expired, and I would just note for the record, This is my 18th year in Congress, and I think that's the first time that I've heard a pirate, Jack Sparrow, referred to in the Foreign Affairs Committee. So we appreciate Mr. Yoho for injecting that. And I think our final questioner this afternoon will be the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Vargas. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
California.
My bad, California.
Mr. Chairman, that's okay, but I love California. Just want to make sure it didn't get confused with Florida. I love Florida, too.
Sorry about that.
I guess I would say this. I hope it's not inevitable that Iran would get nuclear weapons, because unfortunately I think that they would use them. I mean, I think it is one of those regimes that would be willing to do that. I've been very skeptical of this interim agreement. I think it was a bad deal. I continue to think it's a bad deal because of naivete on our side. I'm even more skeptical of a long-term agreement if it's not a permanent agreement. And the reason for that is I remember 1979. I'm old enough to remember that. And the hostage taking, that was 35 years ago. I mean, certainly I think the Iranians will wait us out if it's only 7 or 10 years, and they'll have the ability then to break out and have a nuclear weapon. And I think that they would use that in many different ways. Even if they didn't use the weapon itself, which I think they probably would, they would use it at least to destabilize the area. And so I look at this very skeptically. I did think that the sanctions program was working. I think what we did here in this House was the appropriate thing, and that was to ratchet them down. And then if we were going to get to an agreement, I think the agreement had to be this, that either you do away with your nuclear program completely, no enrichment, no ability to create a nuclear weapon, or we continue down this path of sanctions and you have no economy and you probably lose your regime. Make them decide that first. Then you can back up and do the interim agreements. We didn't do that, unfortunately, and so I think we're in a very difficult situation. So now what do we do? I mean, we're in this situation now. I think that it is a very dangerous one. What do we do? I mean, you're the experts. What should we do?
I would say given the fact that our coercive leverage has not been sufficient to compel Iranian compliance, I think it's time for Congress and the White House to sort of come together on what they want to see in terms of another sanctions bill. The White House would have its preferences and equities, and the Congress would have, but I think it's time for the two branches of government to come together. If our leverage has not been sufficient to get Iranian compliance in the last 6 months, why do we think it's going to be sufficient to get Iranian agreement in the next 6 months, unless we do something different? So that's what I would recommend.
How about yourself, Mr. Modell?
The only thing I would add, I think the only reason Iran has come to the negotiating table, and I mean this is a point that's been stressed over and over, is out of economic necessity, and it's because we had a strong position. And the sanctions that this Congress put forth were as strong as they've ever been. It's fantastic. I agree with Dr. Takey's guidance that the administration, there has to be better collaboration on this between this administration and the Congress on figuring out the way forward. The last thing I would do is make sure that we shore up allied support on, from the European Union in particular on oil sanctions and other things before we lose them.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs.
Following up just on this point, I think to maintain the sanctions and to maintain cooperation from our allies, it's crucial that if these talks fail, whether this week or in 6 months, that Iran is blamed. That Iran is blamed in the eyes of others and not the United States. And this entails from us to be slightly more pragmatic in the short term, but keeping our eye on the long game. And to do that, we need to make sure, we need to understand, I think, that the key to keeping this pressure on Iran is actually our alliance with the other P5+1 countries and the EU in particular. And to do that, we'll have to be creative about how we approach this problem.
And I guess I would say this, we always talk in sort of obfuscating terms here. We always say, keep all the options on the table. Mr. Modell, you kind of broke that taboo today, and you actually talked about using conventional force. And I'd like to talk just a second about that, because I think that there is this huge hesitation even to think about that, other than in this obscure sort of way of saying keep all options on the table. But what really would it look like if we had to do something militarily? Let's talk about that for a second, because I think we should say what it is, and that is not all options on the table, but military action.
I'm not sure what the context was in which I said that. That I said I would advocate the use of the
not the advocation of it, the possibility of it. That might need to be what we do.
No, actually, I think that listen, as long as the Supreme Leader thinks that that's possible, I think it's going to compel him to actually take the fact that we're pushing on this nuclear issue seriously. If he doesn't believe there is that threat even exists or is credible any longer, I think he's going to start trying to figure out all the to fall back on all the sophisticated ways in which they've relied on denial and deception and dissimulation for the last 35 years. I personally agree that we need to go back to what you just suggested, which was a very strong sanctions position before anything else.
I agree. My time has expired. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And again, my apologies for misidentifying the gentleman's state. I apologize.
No worries, sir.
So I think that concludes the questioners this afternoon. So this morning, rather, actually we are afternoon. And would like to thank the panel for their testimony. All members will have 5 days to extend their remarks or submit written questions. If there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you.